Hi all. I'm going to try and make this one of the shorter videos in our series just because I think it's interesting information, but there are so many new details that maybe we'll just focus on the ones that impact us right now. This chapter on revolution is about the revolution in Vietnam. And one way to think of this is it's a revolution without a home. And the focus for this little learning session on Vietnam has to be on one man, because one man, just as in China, one man was so persistent and had such perseverance that eventually his dream became the dream of the nation. And that man was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a man of many names. We're going to go through each of his names as kind of a representation of the different chapters of his life. He was born in Vietnam, and his given name was Nguyen Sinh Cung. Nguyen Sinh Cung. And in this case, we are using that last part as his family name, although Vietnamese, just like Chinese, has the last name first. But this is what we will go with. Nguyen Sinh Cung was born to a family of very accomplished people, and his father was a Confucian scholar and a teacher of calligraphy. And this is something he passed down to his son. And within his family, there were many people who studied traditional herbal medicines and geomancy, which is a word that describes feng shui, if you know what that is. It's basically the idea that there's energy everywhere in a situation, in a geographical situation or in a house, and you need to position things right to get the energy channeled the right direction. So in his family, they had all kinds of traditional learning going on, and definitely Nguyen Sinh Cung, who is Ho Chi Minh, he absorbed this. When he came of age, his father gave him a new name, which was the Vietnamese tradition, and it was Nguyen Tat Thanh. Nguyen Tat Thanh, and that was a name that meant Nguyen, that which was his given name, Nguyen the accomplished. So clearly, the name is auspicious, it's a good name, and his father was probably giving him that name to help him accomplish things and live up to his name, but also because he had already accomplished quite a bit. At some point, he actually became connected with a French ship that was in that area and worked on that ship for a time as a cook's assistant. And then he was on another American ship, and that probably inspired him to realize that Vietnam was not the whole world, and so he started exploring. Clearly, his travels show that he came from a family that had a certain amount of privilege. He had resources. He had skills that were in demand. He was a pastry chef at various times. He did many jobs that were jobs that would have maybe supported him in his travels. And so he eventually ended up in Paris. And let me back up. Sorry, I'm going too fast, because he actually went to the United States, and in 1912 there's evidence. There was a postmarked letter that went to Vietnam from the United States that shows that he was there. And again, his name now is Nguyen Tat Thanh. Nguyen Tat Thanh. And Thanh then is his name, and there's evidence that he was in the United States, and he was apparently learning about revolution from some Korean nationalists. He had already learned a little bit from his father, because his father not only was a scholar, but eventually worked for the government in Vietnam, the French government, and he was basically in a situation where there was injustice, and he resisted, and he lost his position as a result. He didn't want to work for the French because of the things that happened, and this rubbed off on his young son. And then when Thanh or Ho Chi Minh, when he was in the United States, he met with these different radical groups, and they helped him understand what revolution could be. He also then traveled to the UK. He lived in London for a period of time, again working at various French restaurants, creating French pastries, and then he moved on to Paris. In Paris, he had the name Wen I Quoc. Now, again, you've got to know that the spellings of these names are very different than they sound. So Wen, N-G-U-Y-E-N, Wen, and Quoc, Q-U-O-C. I actually know how to say those because I had a good friend in high school named Wen, and so he kind of helped me know how to pronounce those Vietnamese words. So in Paris, he was Wen I Quoc, and that means when the radical, okay, when the radical. And so he had already become radicalized, and that would continue through the rest of his life. He moved from Paris to the Soviet Union, and so at this point, he was gaining patrons and support from people who saw him as a budding communist. And he used a different pseudonym, a fake name on a passport going to the Soviet Union, Chun Vang. Chun Vang was his name there. And then he moved on to China, Thailand, India, and Hong Kong. And there he had a different name on his passport, Lai Tui. Lai Tui. Now, why would he keep changing his name at this point, and especially having these basically fake documents? Because as a radical, he was in danger constantly and under suspicion, and so he was constantly changing his identity. In Hong Kong, he was actually arrested, and the British government there was under pressure to extradite him to Vietnam, but the British government didn't want to mess with that, so they just said he's dead. Very interesting background story. The Viet Minh is a familiar sounding word because Vietnam, Viet Minh, this is the organization that Wen or Ho Chi Minh would create. And he started this group as a radical revolutionary organization. And at this point, his name, one of the many names that he used was Wen O Phap. Wen O Phap meant Wen who hates the French. And that clearly expresses the fact that he wanted to get rid of French colonialism. Interesting side note, there is an excellent video called The Young Indiana Jones, and it has different episodes. And one episode is where young Indy is at the Versailles Conference after World War I, and he is learning about all these different groups. Lawrence of Arabia is his friend from the past and speaks on behalf of the Arab people and helps to create the nation of Iraq. Well, Ho Chi Minh actually pops up in that video, and he is a chef, dishwasher, works at a French restaurant, and he tries to get Indy to speak on his behalf to President Wilson and wants to ask the conference at Versailles to give the Vietnamese people freedom from French colonialism. And they ignore him. Everybody ignores him. Indy didn't ignore him, but in real life, he was ignored, and so were the Vietnamese people. And so there were other incidents that happened in Nanjing, for example, incidents and plotting. He was starting to create the Indo-China Communist Party. Again, he'd been trained in the Soviet Union and in China and had all these different versions of communism that he was learning about. One of the main things, though, that isn't always true about communism, he created an anti-imperialist front. And his idea was that the future of Vietnam depended on everybody coming together to resist the colonizers, the imperialists. And so that was his mission. And then World War II broke out. Now, some people might say that's a terrible thing, and we know that it was terrible, but for Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese, they saw it as an opportunity. In 1941, the Japanese invaded Indochina, and it happened because, well, Japan needed more resources and they had imperial ambitions, but they also were facing an embargo from the United States on steel, and that made them desperate, and so they eventually attacked both the United States at Pearl Harbor in 1941, December 7th, and also the British colonies in Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore. Now, in Vietnam, the Vietnamese people then found themselves facing not only the French, and at this time the French had lost already. Very quickly they lost to the Nazis. And so there was a French government, a puppet government in France, but also in all of the French colonies, and it was called the Vichy government, V-I-C-H-Y. And the Vichy French were controlling Vietnam, but then the Japanese came in and they were attacking. And so the Vietnamese found themselves fighting both groups at the same time. Well, President Roosevelt in the United States knew all this was going on. And in his mind, he realized that the French were kind of going off in the wrong direction. The fact that they were basically occupied by the Nazis and seemed to have different goals from the United States in many ways. And there's a sense that Roosevelt, FDR, that he didn't want the French to be in charge of Vietnam anymore. And he supported the Vietnamese. He supported Ho Chi Minh against the Japanese. And this is very important because it ends up being something that's very ironic, that we supported Ho Chi Minh, but then later on he would become one of our greatest enemies, at least as a symbol of what was going on in Vietnam. The August Revolution was the moment that Ho Chi Minh seized to drive out the French for good and to declare a republic, a democratic republic. That sounds pretty good. So the August Revolution, it started really with that Japanese occupation of Vietnam. They were controlling things, and the Vietnamese wanted them out just like they wanted the French out. What happened is, on March 9th, 1945, the Japanese assaulted the French and basically knocked out the rest of the French control over Vietnam. And it created a vacuum and an opportunity for Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. And with the end of World War II, that would see the Allies winning, and the Allies sent the British to administer Vietnam, the southern part of Vietnam. The northern part of Vietnam was supposed to be administered by China, by Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic of China. They were very weak and basically allowed Vietnam a lot more leeway, and they didn't want the French to come back in. But the British did bring the French. They brought French advisors and officials, and basically it didn't take very long before the French had gone back to their old ways and started taking over the south of Vietnam. And this is at the end of World War II. And so what happened is on August 14th, 1945, a general uprising happened in Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh soldiers. His soldiers were called the Men in Black, about 10,000, basically his own militia. And so at that point, he had a lot more soldiers, and there was a general uprising, and on September 2nd, 1945, he issued a Declaration of Independence, and he actually cited Thomas Jefferson at that moment. And it was exciting to see that maybe this could be a dramatic new nation, and it was called the Provisional Democratic Republic. So again, one of the most significant things about learning about Vietnam and learning about Ho Chi Minh is to see these near misses of history, to see these choices that were made by Vietnam, also by France, but specifically about America, because we as Americans, we learn about history, but we also need to think about what could be different if we look at the past. We can avoid repeating the same mistakes from that past. And what we have to talk about next is really the beginning of a very sad period. Just the beginning. This is called the First Indochina War. And it's called the First Indochina War, just like the First World War, because there was another one. In fact, there were 3 Indochina wars. Remember, Indochina is referring to Southeast Asia and specifically Vietnam. And it was a colonial name. The French created the colony of French Indochina. And so the First Indochina War was, it began with that problem that was created by World War II, but also the opportunity. You had a France that was occupied by the Nazis and complicit, some would say, and that means they're working together with the Nazis, even though there was a resistance in France. But they had been overrun by the Nazis, and then there was a government that was set up. They were French people, but they were Nazi controlled. They were puppets of the Nazi government. And so that was called Vichy France. And so in the colony of French Indochina, you had Vichy France representatives controlling it. And when Vietnam started their uprising, they were fighting against those French puppet French rulers and officials. And they were also supporting against the Japanese, they were fighting against the Japanese aggression. Ultimately, we need to see that America stepped in and actually supported Ho Chi Minh. And there was at least some dialogue between Ho Chi Minh and the United States. And then the war was won by the Allies. So it should all be happily ever after, right? The problem is that France was one of the Allies. Even though they were defeated temporarily, they were a part of the decision-making process. And so they returned to Vietnam. And essentially, Ho Chi Minh realized this was his moment. The uprising and revolution happened in the north, and it also happened in the south, but it was more sluggish, more difficult in the south. And that led to this separation between north and south. And remember, the Chinese were kind of responsible for what was going on in the north, and the British in the south, along with the French. And so the French grabbed onto their power again when they could, and so that the South wasn't as easily taken over and reformed by Ho Chi Minh. And so the French returned, and Ho Chi Minh wanted to have some kind of partnership to be a free state, but have a relationship with France. That was possible, and they had negotiations, and the French agreed to many of the demands that Ho Chi Minh made regarding how many French troops would be allowed in Vietnam. The problem is that the French had a long history of breaking their promises. And this is something where we should all be convicted, whether as individuals or as a country. Are we keeping the promises that we make to people around the world, or are we saying things just to make a deal, and then later on we deny that we made those promises? Or if the political party changes, we refuse to acknowledge those promises. This is the history of the Vietnam War. And so the Second Indochina War involved American intervention and thousands and thousands of people killed, and a whole generation changed forever, and really the whole world changed forever. So when those talks broke down because Vietnam knew they couldn't trust France, it ended up in full-scale rebellion and again, a feeling of betrayal on the part of Ho Chi Minh when he tried to get help from the United States under President Harry Truman. Once Roosevelt died, Truman didn't respond. Now, we don't know if he got all of the communications from Ho Chi Minh, and every president has a whole lot of things going on. One thing that was happening that we need to remember from the Cold War is that Truman was very concerned about communist takeovers, the domino theory all over Southeast Asia. You have the USSR that wants countries to become communist. You have China that wants countries to become communist. And Vietnam was going to become communist. So is that why Truman ignored Ho Chi Minh's request for support against the French? It's hard to say, but it was a very fateful decision. I hope this helps you understand the period of revolution in Vietnam, and I hope that you'll compare it with what happened in the United States, with what happened in China and India. That's the purpose of these units that we're studying. Thanks very much.